Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ACWS in Conversation with Lewis Cardinal, number 5, Indigenous Women in Indigenous Societies. Thank you for joining us, taking the time out of your day this early morning to learn and share and have a conversation with us. Before I introduce our guests, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory and home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. We recognize that all Albertans are treaty people and have a responsibility to understand our history so that we can honor the past, be aware of the present, and create a just and caring future. We honor the courage and strength of Indigenous women who have lived in this river valley, forging diplomatic relationships and as foundation builders for this province. We honor them as life givers and caregivers as we honor and learn from their continuing achievements, their consistent strength, and their remarkable endurance. Today we are joined by members located on Treaties 6, 7, and 8 lands, as well as across the 6 Métis regions of Alberta. Today we will be exploring Indigenous women in Indigenous societies. We'll be looking at what role gender plays in Indigenous societies, the roles women play in Indigenous societies, communities, governments, and families, how colonialism specifically targeted and continues to target and impacts Indigenous women, how Indigenous women have resisted colonization and worked to preserve and revitalize their cultures, and the role that shelters and we as shelter workers can play in supporting Indigenous women, their children, and communities. I'd just like to make a quick housekeeping note too. If you have any issues with sound or video, you can just type them into the chat bar and I'll help you out. But now I would like to introduce our guests. So today we have Lewis Cardinal, who has a long track record of involvement with many human rights and social advocacy boards. He was a founding board member of Racism Free Edmonton, vice president of the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, founder of the Indigenous Peoples Arts and Cultural Coalition, founding board member of Alberta Aboriginal Arts, and co-chair of the Aboriginal Commission on Human Rights and Justice. We also have joining us today, which we're very lucky to have, Dr. Tracy Bear, who is a Cree woman, academic, and member of the Montreal Lake Cree Nation located in northern Saskatchewan. Her research areas are diverse, but all are rooted in decolonial methodologies and epistemologies of Indigenous studies. Dr. Bear engages in the areas of Indigenous erotics and erotic analysis, Indigenous feminism, gender and sexuality studies, sovereignty, land and body politics, Indigenous queer and two-spirit studies, and contemporary Indigenous art. Dr. Bear teaches at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Native Studies and Women and Gender Studies and is the academic lead for the popular Indigenous Canada MOOC. She is a member of the Walking with Our Sisters National Collective, the co-producer for TB Confessions Project, and the director for Indigenous Women and Youth Resilience Projects. Unfortunately, our other guest, Elder Sylvia Lowhorn, is ill and unable to join us today, but that just means we'll get to have her on another time. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Lewis and Tracy Bear. Thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Tracy, for joining us. It's a real honor, and you know, I've been one of your fans and watching you doing all that awesome work, you know, and everything that you're doing. It's quite incredible. It's wonderful. A lot of your work has really examined Indigenous women within Indigenous societies and some of the issues and some of the history that Indigenous women have within our communities. And in one of our last webinars, we had talked about and I touched very briefly on it, but Indigenous women and how we had placed them within our societies prior to colonization. And that really piqued a lot of interest for some folks. So I said, you know, we have to bring someone in here who can talk about this specific things a bit more focused. So first question I have for you, in terms of gender roles in Indigenous societies, how do or did Indigenous societies conceptualize, define gender, assign, or communicate gender identity?
These are great questions. I just want to first say I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I know we both have done a lot of work in and around this area. So thank you for having me here today. And I do work a lot in the area of Indigenous women, and one of the reasons for this is pretty obvious, I think, being an Indigenous woman. And so the reason I started looking at gender and looking at Indigenous women's roles in our society is I felt that there was a real discrepancy between what I was being told had happened prior to contact and sort of the end result of what we were seeing today in leadership positions and how Indigenous women are viewed and the current status of Indigenous women in Canada. And so when I looked into it, I noticed that there wasn't this binary, the dichotomy of a male and female prior to contact. There was research all across North America, Canada, the US, and even South America that showed us that there wasn't a binary of male-female, that gender was actually on a spectrum. And so when you have gender on the spectrum, you don't have these black and white roles, these black and white areas of what females are supposed to do and what males are supposed to do. So I found that really fascinating. And I wondered how it could reflect and how that knowledge could be used in creating a safe space for not only Indigenous women today, but all the folks that fit in that spectrum and that don't fit a male or female binary. And I think that knowledge can be really used today. So what I found is that not only were there two genders, but sometimes third, fourth, fifth, and sixth genders. And recently I was at a conference with Harlan Pruden, and he found Cherokee and down southern United States, there was a seventh gender as well.
Yeah.
So we put into perspective this idea that gender is on a spectrum, then we can have more roles and have a broader diversity and more fluidity in the types of things, responsibilities, and roles that we have as Indigenous people. And so when people ask me, well, okay, so we have this genderful or gender fluid sort of society, how does that translate into everyday life? Like how would we know who was to go hunting and who was to be taking care of the children and babies? And what I have found in that is that societies, pre-contact societies, didn't actually look and see a baby being born, it was female or male. They waited to see what the child's special skills were, their talents, the things that they gravitated towards. And as they grew, the people would watch them. And so as long as that child was fulfilling a role and a responsibility within the tribe, then that child was absolutely accepted. It didn't matter if biologically they looked female. If they had skills in hunting, then that's something that they would be encouraged to do. But the number one thing is because you're living in sometimes difficult environmental situations, you need every single member of that tribe to be functioning and to be fulfilling their role. So that's the main priority that they were looking at. And I thought that was really interesting in this society when we see people with varying skills, but we keep them here because we see them as female, or we keep them here because we see them as male. That's really restrictive, and I don't think we're taking advantage of this idea of a genderful society when we have restrictive gender roles being played out, not just for Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people as well.
Well, I like the idea of fluidity. You put it on a spectrum. That makes a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. Some of the teachings that I've grown up with from the elders that I've worked with that have talked about that fluidity, and that to place one thing into one place at one time for all time is not doing a service and honoring the spirit of who the individual is, mm-hmm. or needs to become. Mm-hmm. So how, when we're defining gender, how would you define that specifically?
Gender. So I guess to go through a few terms, I mean, cis male and cis female, for our audience, I don't know if they would be familiar with those terms, but a cis male would be someone who not only looks male, but actually feels male on the inside. And the same goes for a female. So there's biological differences between male and female, but there are also, as we know from history that there are all different kinds of babies being born with various biological parts that may not conform to strictly female or male. So gender can also not only be biological, but it's also the responsibility or role that you see yourself playing and looking the part. So it's a very complex idea, but generally when people ask me about that, we don't, the most important thing in this to remember is you don't police anyone's bodies. And so, for example, if we're going into ceremony and there are skirts that are asked to be worn for women or women, it's really important to make sure that you're not policing bodies when they come into the ceremony. There are females that may look female on the outside but don't necessarily feel female on the inside. And so where it's really important to understand that what you see is not always what the person might feel like on the inside. And it's important to acknowledge that.
I know that it's today, as we're returning and rediscovering some of these cultural differences around gender and gender roles, I know it becomes an issue in ceremonies for Indigenous women who, you know, don't feel that they, you know, need to wear the skirt or what have you. That is a point, but the thing that I'm getting at is that it's a conversation that I think is really, it's timely, it's incredibly important for our time now, and it's something that we have to sink into more because it's a part of our recovery as Indigenous nations. What traditionally, I guess you could say, is like, what roles did women play in community and governance back prior to colonization or shortly after colonization?
Research in archives is really, really fascinating because one of the things that you have to do as an Indigenous person is read between the lines. A lot of what was written were by European anthropologists and historians, and so coming with a male perspective, these anthropologists aren't entirely cognizant of the roles that women played, and so they wouldn't necessarily write down all the things that women did, finding them, deeming them unimportant at that time, in that time period. And so for researchers like us, we have to kind of read between the lines, and some of the things that I've found and other researchers have found as well is that when we are talking about women and men's roles, especially in governance and leadership, that there was a really great balance, and there may have been on the outset in certain societies, say for instance Cree societies, male leaders, significantly male, so they would be male, but what people didn't see in the back happening was the women who were choosing the male leaders,
yes, or
motivating them or encouraging them in certain ways. And so I think there was always this great balance between I guess male and female, and also if we talk about the genderful people, the people in between, they always had special roles.
Yes.
And I think if there was a too strong of balance in male leadership, not only would the females say, hey, wait a minute, this is going sideways, but the genderful people would also have a role in saying and having that, having a say in balancing it out. And so I think the opposite might happen too. You know, things were going sideways in women's society, we would have that genderful person in the middle saying, okay, wait a minute, something's going on here. So it was always this really nice equilibrium happening. Not to say there wasn't issues happening all the time in any society, we're human, right? But there was always a great balance in leadership.
With in your researches, have you been able to identify a matrilineal and matriarchal tradition within the Cree people?
Not so much within Cree that I have found yet. I'm sure if we dig a little bit deeper, I'm sure those stories are there. And certainly today we see a lot of strong Cree women taking leadership roles, not just in like chief and council, but other leadership roles and activism.
Oh,
Idle
absolutely.
No More, you see Tanya Capo, and you see, Sylvia McAdam taking great roles in that. And so oftentimes what I see in the roles and the places that I'm at with walking with our sisters, doing my prison work or in the university, I see Indigenous women rising constantly and taking on informal leadership roles, activism roles. They're really important. Not so much maybe yet in chief and council, but I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's power in other ways as
Yes.
well, right?
I remember my grandmother. She was my great women influence, my first Indigenous women leader that I could think of. And she was very direct in what I had to do. First of all, she said, "You don't get married. You don't take a wife. You take a partner." And she was using that kind of language long before it was used publicly.
Mm-hmm.
But she also was a keen negotiator when it came to business. She negotiated vehicles that she decided, told my grandfather, "Okay, we need a new truck. This is how much money I need in order to make this deal." So she was already making deals. But in doing a very limited research in my own way, I found that Indigenous women were really critical back in the day to the trade, starting with the fur trade.
Absolutely.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think that's something that we forget often in history. It's not written about again, right? So what I've seen is this, many history books show us that they come from a deficit model, right? They think Indigenous women didn't have agency. But what I've seen, especially in the fur trade, Indigenous women absolutely had agency. And we talk about the mariage à la façon du pays, the country wife.
Yes.
Some people think, wow, these Indigenous women, they married fur traders and then were abandoned. But what we don't see in the background for some of the cases of Indigenous women really had an agency in that, and negotiating marriage, negotiating, uplifting their family. So making those kinship ties with the fur traders, enabled them to learn English and French quickly, enabled them to get access to trade goods more quickly, and have an insider's view of the colonizing countries that were coming in. So we often forget that women had desires, they have agency, and they actually moved and negotiated it in the world in the ways that they could.
Yes. I descend from Chief Mustos and Canusio, who made Treaty 8. I also have two fourth great uncles. One is named Babastes, and one is named Michel Kelly. Signatures to Treaty 6. One story that came down from the Treaty 8 making back in 1899. My fourth great grandfather on my Métis side was Sam Cunningham, who was based out of Lac Saint Anne, but he was interpreting for the treaty at Willow Point on Lesser Slave Lake, and it wasn't called the Edmonton Journal; it was called the Edmonton Bulletin. So one of the reporters there was recording the event, and as they were standing watching the conversation and the dialogue and the negotiating going back and forth, what was happening? Here's the setting: is that you had the big white tent of the commissioners, and then gathered around that were all the Indigenous men, chiefs and leaders, Mustas, Canusio, etc. But in the back, maybe about 3 or 4 yards away, were women and children, all crowded around there. And every now and again, a woman would run and go talk to her man, and then run back. And you'd see this sporadically throughout the whole thing. And finally, the Edmonton Bulletin reporter asked, he goes, so Sam, because can you tell me what's going on here? And so Sam said, yeah. He said, your commissioners won't talk to the women and negotiate with them. So what they have to do and what they're left with is they have to run to their men and tell them, don't forget about this, don't forget about that, expand on this and expand on that.
Yeah.
So Indigenous women have played a large part in our politics, and it'll be interesting to see just how much they contributed to treaty making process as well.
Absolutely.
So what were their roles in politics and those kind of politics at that time?
I think that was a really good example. Another example I might share is in the 1740s on the East Coast, when the Jesuits were there, they actually had a lot of journals. They wrote a lot back. And so we can look at those journals and see they were shocked, absolutely shocked, that the women had such a role in the leadership, and confounded because, of course, in Europe at that point, women were considered property.
Yes.
They were not even considered human. And
Yeah.
so they were shocked to see women involving themselves in governance and leadership decisions, political decisions, where to move the camp. And so through the course of 2 years, you see the journals change. And so the writing sort of switched. And so the Jesuits formed the opinion that, and sort of gave the opinion to the men at the time on the East Coast, that your women are overriding you, your women, you're not real men if you listen to your women. And so this change in discourse from the Jesuits really came across in these journals that I saw. And so if we reflect on that, we think, wow, so these women had these huge decision-making plans,
Yes.
and the influence of Europeans really kind of changed that. So getting back to that, how do we get back to that? And I see a lot of changes in that. Women are taking leadership positions in every single manner and all across the board. And more Indigenous societies are coming to recognize that this is an important equilibrium that needs to be taken back.
Right. One of the most obvious questions is, why would the colonial powers target Indigenous women back in those days? What do you think was a motivating factor for that?
Indigenous women were the caretakers of the land.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important thing for colonizers at that time was to take the land. So Indigenous women as caretakers need to be taken out of the picture. So how do you do that? The introduction of formal Catholic marriages was one thing. So that was a really, that policy or sort of religious right was really important to place upon Indigenous society. So one, you would take the woman out of the picture, because the man would then be granted the property of her family. The children would be property under that as well. But one thing about integration of the European marriage upon Indigenous people was this individualism. So this smaller family, nuclear family, was singled out as being important. So you have the marriage, and then you have the children, and then you have the man owning the property. That way, that individual piece of property could be bought and sold as well, instead of ownership of the land and the caretaking of it. So we know that we have a lot of kinship networks. We're responsible to not just your mom and dad and your children, but a larger network of kin and relationship building. And that is something that would not work in a capitalist society, right? You need an individual. And so that was one of the first things. Of course, we have the Indian Act that happened that really decimated and took a real big chunk out of Indigenous women's agency in law. And I'm not sure if the audience realizes, but the Indian Act until 1985, if an Indian woman who had status was to marry a non-status man or a European man, she would automatically lose her status. Right. And the opposite would occur. So if an Indigenous man married a white woman or a non-Indigenous woman, she would gain status as well as their children. Right. And so that really took the legs out of Indigenous women's agency and ability to lead.
I could see how that attack or that purposeful deconstruction of an Indigenous society and the results that it would have, and we're living with those results today. Indigenous women were central to our trading traditions, because when a European trader would come in and take a country wife or a wife, it wasn't just the one person, the one. He knew that he was marrying into a whole network of extended family and other people that really helped in the economy of the fur trade in the first 250 years in Canada. And that's often forgotten. Again, how important of a role that Indigenous women had in politics and trade in the very heart of the community. You've mentioned a couple times now that we're seeing that resurgence, the stepping forward of Indigenous women into many roles. And I think the university, or pretty much any university, there's more Indigenous women as students than there are Indigenous men.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just in undergrad, but in graduate levels, MAs and PhDs graduating are 80% Indigenous women compared to men.
80%?
80%.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's important to mention as well when we're talking about leadership is this idea of women reclaiming that back. But one of the challenges, I think, for Indigenous women leaders and activists is the tenuous idea of women as being somehow not as equal. And so I think Indigenous women have a long way to go, not just in European or Western society, but also within our own communities,
Yes.
getting back to our rightful place as leaders and having that equilibrium again. We know that our societies in the past didn't exclude people, that it was inclusive. And one of my elders often says there's no closets in the teepee. So, you know, we had a place for everybody because we had to. We lived in harsh environments, and so we needed everybody in the tribe, like I said. So it doesn't make sense that you would exclude someone, that you would need everybody to be a part of that to thrive and survive.
So we're starting to see more of that leadership growth. And all we have to do is look at the Canadian Native Friendship Centers. That whole urban Indigenous movement really was born very much from the women who were denied their rights back into their communities. And it's I think it's one of those great untold stories of the resiliency of Indigenous women. Even though, you know, the cause and the effect was quite negative, but they came out in a form of resistance still to maintain their identity within an urban setting. So how are Indigenous women resisting colonization today?
Wow. So a lot of people see resistance and resilience as this big word. So, you know, chaining yourself to a Kinder Morgan cat or, you know, or a pipeline. But and there is that too. There is that activism. There is the flash mob round dances, all those types of things. But what about those little things that we see and do every day as Indigenous women? The loads that I see many Indigenous women carrying, it's absolutely quite remarkable. I teach at the university and just taught Indigenous feminism and women 400 level course, and 2/3 of my class were Indigenous women, which was absolutely fantastic. But listening to their stories, it was really valuable for other students in the class to have an understanding that, and I used this analogy before, that for me, my Indigenous students and many Indigenous women are just these icebergs, and they have you just see this little tip, and they're in school and they're doing what they're doing and they're being successful, but underneath they're carrying a huge load. They're often the breadwinners. They're holding down a couple of jobs as well as going to university. They have children or grandchildren or siblings that they're taking care of. And so they're also activists. So they have this huge thing that they're doing below the surface. And I think that I see that as pure resilience and resistance and those little things that they do every day.
Yes, it's for me, it's really encouraging to see, because I live by that old Cheyenne proverb that says that a nation is never truly defeated until the hearts of its women are broken on the ground, no matter how fierce their warriors may be.
Yes.
And it's something that was really instilled by my grandmother. And I was raised with eight sisters.
No wonder I like you.
8 sisters, 7 aunts on my mother's side, and 6 aunts on my father's side. So there was always that sense of responsibility. And I think, well, as a traditional man, I always ensure that I look to the women for that direction and guidance. My grandfather taught me when I was 14, and I laughed at the time. I don't laugh anymore, but he said, "It'll be woman who teaches you how to be warrior." You know, these are great values to be able to instill in yourself, and I've instilled those in my children too, to carry that in our heart, because our women have really suffered the most in terms of our society, and they have a lot to do to help rebuild the nation. And to hear these numbers at the university and universities across Canada, I think is really a sign of hope. But what are some of the signs of hope that you're seeing in the work that you do?
I guess since I've been at the university since 2002, I've seen a growth in Indigenous women enrolling and succeeding, going to law school, getting more graduate programs, MA and PhD. It's not even something they're like, oh, maybe I'll do that. They're in their second year undergrad and they're like, okay, I'm going to go to law school. Okay, I'm doing this master's in this program. And I absolutely adore the students that come. Where else do I see it? Other aspects of my life that I work in is walking with our sisters. This art memorial that's been going across Canada and down into the States since 2013.
Yes.
And so we're going into communities and we're seeing this galvanization of community. So before we get there, there's a year of preparing, and it's often pushed forward by Indigenous women. So we get to the community, we prepare for the install. We have women holding ceremony, holding pipes, and then hundreds of volunteers coming to honor and remember missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's really quite a powerful thing to see. Another site, I was recently at a conference with all these amazing Indigenous women and looking around in the room, and there was 10 of us that had our PhDs, 2 were lawyers. And education is just one aspect of being successful. Of course, we have activists all over the place doing amazing work. So I was at this conference, and this woman was she was a clinical psychologist, and she was talking about stats and things. And her husband, she has 4 kids, and her husband was in the audience with the baby. And as she was talking to this 100+ audience, the baby started crying, and the husband was like trying his best, but she just waved him over calmly, took the baby, put a sling on, and as she was still talking about this complex topic, she started breastfeeding, never missing a beat. And I'm like, that is an amazing woman right there. She didn't blink an eye, birthed the baby, and then handed it back and went on with her talk. It was remarkable.
I had the honor of taking my daughter with me to Standing Rock. And, so we spent a few days there. What I found striking is that while this was the movement born by the Standing Rock Sioux, they certainly owned that responsibility. What was interesting for me is that I was able to see almost immediately the roles that men and women were playing at that time. And so when we were brought in, they would ask us a couple questions at the gate. What are you here for? Are you here to support? Are you here to do this? Or are you media, right? So we said, we're here to help, to support. And I said, okay, if you want to support, then you go to this, they called it the bubble. It was a great big golf dome sort of thing. That's where everybody would meet because it was a big space. And they would do orientations like every hour and a half or something like that. So we went in, and then there's a number of us standing around and waiting for instructions. And it was the women who came out and told us some of the background, the history, and said, if you want to help us, we have tasks for you to do. Because everybody wants a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes. So they said, if you want to go stand, and on the front lines and get sprayed by water cannons, go take this course over here, so you know what you're doing, how to properly resist. And then if you want to help clean up and do things like that, then you go here and you go here. So we went to a couple sessions led by women again, teaching us how to not only protest and stand in front of the water cannons, but also how to take care of ourselves if we got tear gassed and things like that. So it's really quite striking for me to see that movement and that action really carrying that spirit of the role of women in terms of how they were giving us direction. And
because they were warriors.
That's right.
They're warriors.
They gave us real quick lessons on that. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of actions and movements are you seeing today? We know about I don't know more. What other ones are you seeing that's capturing your attention?
The Kinder Morgan pipeline. Obviously, we have a lot of women chiefs standing up. I just saw a podcast today, actually. Yes. So there was an Indigenous man on one side promoting it, and then an Indigenous woman saying, this is not going to happen, not on my watch. Yeah. And so we see it with that. I see it with the Christy Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch and their protests across Canada as well. Water is life, as water protectors all across Canada. We're finding Indigenous women becoming, not in any official way, but claiming this water protector role.
Yes.
And knowing that coming back to earlier when we talked about caretaking of the land and that was taken away, that's being reclaimed again. Despite the ownership and property laws that we have today under the Canadian state, we're still responsible for that water, still responsible for caretaking of this land that we're on. And despite them not owning it officially, they're still caretaking for it.
Yes.
And you see women on the front line doing all of that kind of work every day, and walking across Canada, bringing awareness to what we're doing to our waterways and our environment.
That's right. There's very large water walks happening around the Great Lakes as well, led by women, of course. And again, carrying out their traditional roles. And I think that's an important point to make, is that these resistances, these movements, these actions isn't about Indigenous people getting a larger piece of the action.
No, not at all.
It certainly is about the roles and responsibilities, once again, Indigenous women have in our societies. And of course, men as well, because we're learning as well. We're learning how to take our place respectfully and properly in these actions.
Absolutely. And on that point, I think there's still so much work to be done with Indigenous men, understanding, as you do, not every Indigenous man has the honor to be raised as you did within women, strong Indigenous women. I still think there's so much more work to do. I'd like to have Indigenous men standing with me when we're doing water protecting. I'd love to have Indigenous men stand with me when we're doing our walk for missing and murdered Indigenous women. But the truth of the matter is there's not a lot out there yet.
That's right. And I see that as well. And, you know, the Alberta Council for Women's Shelters and all the shelters that are across the province here, there's 54 of them altogether, 41 running 54 places. But what type of knowledge or information could better serve the shelters in supporting Indigenous women and their children in their care? Any ideas about how that can help to strengthen them, support them, that are under care?
A few ideas.
A few, good.
I think first and foremost, for any of you watching this podcast, this is an absolutely great opportunity for you to learn a little bit more. And anywhere you can get that type of information and knowledge. I always say to any settler ally that, you know, it's not up to me to educate you. It's up to you to educate you. And I think Justice Murray Sinclair, after the TRC, he said, we've shown you the mountain, and now it's up to you to climb it. And so podcasts such as this, Lewis mentioned the Indigenous Canada MOOC. You can take it for 3 credits, which will cost you some money. You can take it for a certificate, costs you $65. You can also take it for free. And it's a really basic course on Indigenous people's history with this land called Canada. That's a start.
Yes.
Specifically for people working in shelters, go back to my analogy. If I can understand that my students are coming to me not just as a simple student with no children and, you know, fully funded, I've got students that are struggling. And so what you see on the surface is probably not the whole story. Make sure you make the time to understand that whole story. And part of understanding that whole story is understanding the history that Canada has with its Indigenous people. That's a start.
that's a lot of work too.
It's a lot of work, but like we said in the beginning, this is a part of reconciliation. This is a part of being a treaty person on this land, and it's your responsibility.
Yes, exactly. And as ally organizations. One thing I like that the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters has done here, as a part of our acknowledgement, we drafted 54 local statements of acknowledging treaty, but not just that you're on treaty this or you're on treaty that, but that relational aspect of treaty and the responsibility that comes along with that. Mm-hmm. What this office did is they decided that they wanted to add Treaty 6 into their mailing address. And so
I saw that on her email tagline.
Jen Reimer, the executive director, she called Wilton Littlechild, Chief Littlechild, and asked if it was okay. And he said, "Oh wow, this is a great idea. We should start doing that." But the allies are organizations that are really trying to do their best to adjust to become more supportive. Any suggestions for ally organizations in terms structurally, within policy, within anything within their organizational framework that they can do to be more responsive and supportive allies?
Not understanding their policies and structures fully. I think generally there's a few things I can think of is showing up, being there. I'm not an ally, so I don't know, but I've often been asked the same question: how can I be a good ally? And one of the main takeaways, I think, so I could give you a list of 10, top 10, but the takeaway, I think, is to know when to stand up and know when to stand down. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is standing up when from an Indigenous woman or someone being harassed, stand up, even online, stand up and make a statement. And then know when to stand down. There's platforms when you have a large audience, and sometimes, not often, allies will take that stage and thinking they're doing a good thing when there's other Indigenous people that would be able to take that platform. So know when to stand up and know when to stand down. And a good ally works in that way.
Yeah, and I would also acknowledge that doing simple things like that, acknowledging treaty in your mailing address, I think is just a nice show of confidence and friendship. Because again, our treaties and the relationship context of treaties is talking about peace, friendship, and understanding. That has always been a very important part of treaties and treaty making. The other question that I have, I think need to come from our listeners now, because I want to have enough time for us to be able to engage a bit more with what our listeners might have to ask Tracy.
Are there questions?
There are a couple, and there may be some more. So anyone with any additional questions, feel free to just type them into the question box and I'll ask them. So our first question is, you mentioned finding a balance and returning back to equilibrium. And this question is kind of a bigger one. It's like, how do you see Indigenous women and communities finding that balance and equilibrium while claiming space and navigating to make change in colonial institutions and structures like universities and living in a colonial state?
How do we navigate?
How
is it possible to navigate? Well, getting into education, first as an Indigenous person, you have to understand that you're coming into a colonial state. You're already living in that, but institutions such as post-secondaries, as much as they try and as much as they are changing, they still have their 100 years of rules and regulations in their way, and so they're slow to change. So one of the things I think that's happening, if I can talk to my experience on campus, is working with senior administration and doing that teaching with them, making sure that senior administration has that understanding and being open to bringing people along and introducing them to ceremony and other ways of knowing, and understanding that that's going to take a while. And we always put a lot of for me anyway, a lot of work into building relationships. And so not just relationship with other Indigenous people, but that has to go with relationships within the institutions that you're working with, government offices, and other organizations that might not necessarily fall in your purview as an Indigenous person. So building relationships is really an important part, and understanding and trying to make sure that your bosses understand that sometimes that takes a lot of money, resources, and time to do that in a good way.
Thank you. That dovetails really nicely with the second question that came in. What tips or considerations would you have for shelters or organizations that are looking to incorporate ceremonies or elders or other cultural aspects into their programming? So I'm guessing here it's for programming for women in their shelters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Funny thing about ceremonies and traditions, and what I've found out is that for many Indigenous people, especially people who have been affected by residential schools, traditions sometimes morphed or not changed, and they reflect sometimes a colonizer's view of women and where they should be, meaning over here. And so when you're introducing ceremonies and things, it's really great when you find an elder that reflects values of understanding, empathy, kindness, and love. Working with Walking with Our Sisters, at first we did put elders sort of almost on a pedestal almost, and whatever they said goes. But what ended up happening was there's a lot of clashing. So what we eventually ended up doing is saying, we want to work with grandmothers. So they might not be a pipe carrier or carry all of that traditional ceremonial knowledge, but they're kind, they're empathetic, they're loving, and they're caring. And that was really important for us to walk forward in a good way. And that has worked really well since 2013. So if you're going to incorporate ceremonies, make sure that you have found a loving, and if it's women's shelters, a loving grandmother to work with you, to help guide you, and make sure that women in there are feeling safe within the ceremonial realm. I work with students who are often displaced or haven't been to ceremony, and so they're really quite nervous and new at the whole thing. So you need someone gentle to help them work through that, not someone that's going to be really harsh, and because that can also be a form of lateral violence. And so make sure we have someone gentle that you're working with.
I think that you touched on a very important point there, finding and working with people, especially grandmothers, and that is a very critical part of the work that needs to be done. And I think what we're seeing today with not only shelters, but also organizations in general, in terms of how they always ask this question: how can we start to build and maintain relationships with Indigenous people and organizations in our area? Any advice on that?
Absolutely. So at the university and within Walking with Our Sisters, university will pay like an honorarium. It used to be quite small to an elder, but what we don't realize when we take an elder from their community, there's travel time, you're taking them away from family, from their responsibilities there, and they need to be compensated for that. Just like we would for someone that has a PhD in whatever, we pay visiting professors quite a lot of money to come. We need to show the same type of respect for the knowledge that those knowledge keepers carry, and not think that, oh, you're not doing anything anyway, you can come here and share this knowledge. That knowledge has been hard won. Oftentimes the years of protocol and ceremony to gain that knowledge, and for you to ask for it without giving back, without doing that reciprocity is really horrendous. And so making sure that you acknowledge that knowledge that they carry is just as important as any knowledge that any PhD might carry.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And I just had one question to ask, to share the link for the Indigenous Canada MOOC, and yes, I will send that out to everyone after we finish up here. And I did have one follow-up question just of my own that I was thinking while you were speaking as well, in terms of kind of the resurgence and kind of revitalization of Indigenous cultures, and get your view on how you view that. Is that more of kind of a new, do you see it more as kind of pulling them from the past, or do you see it more as they're kind of being changed and evolved and kind of growing to fit the current context of how, you know, people are living their lives today? How do you see that?
I love that question. Yeah. That's fabulous, and it's something that I'm still articulating in my mind, but I'll share my burgeoning thoughts on that. What I'm finding with the restrictions of some traditions that we carry, which are some are incredibly beautiful, and but some of them feel like they're relegated in the past with a colonial lens on them. And so traditions, for me, I see as something that help the people of the time, and they help our people go forward in a good way. But if we're hanging on to traditions from a while ago where colonial oppression happened and sort of changed that, I think we're being owned by our traditions, and I think we're being held back by them in some cases, not all cases. But in some cases, we're being held back because we're excluding people. We're excluding those genderful people from the circle. We're excluding women who might not conform to wearing a skirt. And I think that's a travesty for us, because you don't know what knowledges those people carry. And another thing, a lot of Indigenous younger people who are in urban centers want to go to ceremony. They may be struggling with substance abuse, and then they're excluded from a ceremony that might be the catalyst to help change that. To go to ceremony, there's things that we abide by not, drinking alcohol or having any drugs 4 days. But I see some youth that are doing substances every day, and it might be ceremony that might help relieve them of that, but they're not able to go 4 days without it. And so I think we need to have traditions working for us rather than being restrictive on us. And I see a lot of changes in that realm in the circles that I'm in, this reimagining, so that it works for us, so that we're not excluding anyone, so we become that inclusive society that we've always strived to be.
Once again, you touch on a very important point, and that is the power and influence of ceremony. Oftentimes in mainstream society, and even in my own circles, the understanding of the incredible power that ceremony has in a person's life is often underestimated and not really understood. Can you speak to the importance of ceremony?
Yeah, well, wow, that's a big question, Lewis. Ceremony for me, people, it's really, I guess, hard to describe, but having been part of really powerful ceremonies, I can honestly say that is my saving grace. No matter what family support I have, the education that I have, the experience, where I stand status-wise in society, there is nothing more grounding than ceremony. It brings you back, and you've been in Sundance, so like hearing the drums and understanding that our ancestors, generations back, sang these songs for us at this time. It's a powerful, powerful way to live, and I think without ceremony, I'm not sure where I would be today. So this is my part of my work is at bringing people into ceremony, but ceremony in a safe space, and ceremonies that can work for us rather than restrict us and exclude us.
And done with reputable individuals as well. That's one of the dark sides of what we're dealing with today, is that you have a number of people who call themselves shaman medicine people, but nobody knows who they are in the community.
That's right.
And I always say, go to the community and ask who does good ceremonies for this particular thing.
Yeah.
And listen to what they have to say. It's always been an issue that I've been very concerned of. My own commitment to ceremony really helped me to become an overachiever. Because I realized, there's a lot of things to do. And again, going back to one of my grandmother's teachings, and she said, when you become an Indian, she said, you will never be out of work. You will never be unemployed. There's always something that needs to be done.
That's right. And you might not get paid monetarily,
no,
but you are paid astronomically in other ways, that's for sure. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Any other questions?
There's just one final question from someone that said that they've already done the online MOOC and they very much enjoyed it. And they're just wondering if there's going to be more offerings, if there's going to be follow-ups of that, or if they should just come in and do a full master's in Native Studies. That's what they're wondering.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Come to the Faculty of Native Studies.
Yeah.
We now have a PhD program that you can do after your master's. So, but there is a MOOC. I think they're calling it Mach 2 that's in production right now, and it's an extension of some of the lessons that we're doing. I'm not involved in that, so I'm not exactly sure what they're doing, but Paul Garreau is one of the masters of that, so he'll be doing that.
Well, I just want to ask one more thing, give you the opportunity to share with us, what are you doing now? What are all the things and the hats that you're wearing and everything that you do?
I love my life because all these opportunities, the scary thing about praying to the Creator is that often He'll give you what you ask for, which, what should I do now? So I guess I'm still working with Walking with Our Sisters until next year when it's over after 7 years. We ended in Batoche. I've started working in prisons. I did volunteering back in 2010. And it's always been an interest of mine because Indigenous people are overrepresented in prisons. And I often think because both sets of my grandparents went through residential schools, that easily could be me in there. But my grandma and grandfather became healthy, strong people despite residential school experiences, and raised my mom that way. In turn, giving me this gift of being who I am today. So going into prisons, doing teaching, and a lot of Indigenous people didn't have good experience in school.
No.
High school wasn't a great time for me, and so I can see the reluctance to engage in a post-secondary. And for some, it'll never be their way. But for some of them, there's incredibly gifted critical minds, and they just need that opportunity to see that post-secondary is absolutely a place that they can thrive.
Yes.
And so opening that up, teaching contemporary Indigenous art right now, and just seeing these gifted people that didn't have the opportunities many of us did to go to post-secondary, and opening up to them. So it's one of the things I'm doing. I'm also co-producing a wonderful, sexy storytelling show called Teepee Confessions with Kim Tallbear and Kirsten Lindquist.
Yes.
It's a really fun, safe space to talk about healthy sexuality and a celebration of our bodies in a really fun way. Yeah.
When is that going to be?
The next one, September 7th in Edmonton. We're doing one in Seattle in July, I think, but Edmonton, September 7th. So.
Well, make sure you send us the link and everything like that. And we'll create an event page for you.
Always very fun.
Well, once again, I want to say thank you. It was wonderful to sit with you and listen to your wonderful knowledge and your sharing. So I appreciate it very much.
Aye.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of ACWS and our membership, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And I will be sharing the link to the Indigenous Canada MOOC for anyone that is interested. And hopefully we might be able to have you back again with another elder and revisit some of these topics again. And just like to say thank you very much, and we'll be signing off. There will be an evaluation that for the audience members, there will be an evaluation coming through in your follow-up email, as well as some follow-up resources. So do check those out, and let us know what other conversations you'd like us to have in this space. And thank you for taking the time in the morning, and we'll see you again very soon.